Part 1. A Sense of the Future. Elizabeth sat on the windowsill of her Manhattan apartment, gazing out at the endless sea of lights in New York City. The city pulsed with its usual rhythm, taxi horns honking, pedestrians rushing somewhere, and neon signs flickering atop rooftops from time to time. But Elizabeth felt something unusual, as if the very fabric of time had tensed around her. She couldn't explain the feeling, but her heart tightened with a mix of mild fear and anticipation. That morning, an envelope with no sender lay on her desk. Elizabeth leaned forward, sensing a strange energy emanating from it. Inside was a card that read, "Tomorrow it all begins." No signatures, no traces, just the cold touch of the paper. Elizabeth felt that this was no mere joke. Her work as an analyst at a financial company had trained her to notice patterns where others saw chaos, and this envelope signaled something that had not yet happened. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, Thomas woke up in his apartment in London. He was a journalist, accustomed to breaking news and information storms. Yet that morning, he felt a strange premonition, similar to what Elizabeth had felt in New York. The television in his hotel room displayed news of accidents, chaotic transport disruptions, and inexplicable system failures. He recorded it in his diary, unaware that this day would turn his life upside down. It was a day when small events began to form a pattern. In the streets of New York, the first raindrops fell after a long stretch of heat, while in London, winds swept posters off bridges. These minor details seemed random, but the hearts of the protagonists hinted that this was only the beginning. Elizabeth received her first call from her boss, who rarely called on weekends. "Elizabeth, have you seen the latest energy market reports? Something's off," he said. But when she opened the files, everything looked normal. Only a deep intuition suggested that something important was slipping between the lines. Meanwhile, Thomas received a letter from an anonymous source. It contained coordinates and a time for an event that seemed impossible, along with a warning: "Watch closely. Everything is connected." Thomas was surprised. Usually he would have ignored such messages, but this time he felt compelled to act. In New York and London, the protagonists did not yet know each other, but their fates had already begun to intertwine in an invisible web. Synchronous events, strange coincidences, unexpected alignments of dates and happenings started emerging in their lives. Elizabeth stepped outside to clear her mind. She observed the crowd, people hurrying in different directions, and sensed a peculiar rhythm that seemed to point to a hidden pattern within the chaos. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown sender: "Watch the bridge." At first, she thought it was a mistake, but something in the tone of the message made her pay attention. Meanwhile, Thomas meticulously recorded every detail of the strange occurrences in London. He noticed that news reports and incidents, seemingly unrelated, were following a pattern: accidents, communication breakdowns, chaotic human behaviors. The sequence seemed both predictable and chaotic at the same time. Thus ended the first day. Elizabeth and Thomas had not yet met, but premonitions, unsigned letters, and odd occurrences were beginning to lay the groundwork for what was to come. Both stood on the threshold of a major revelation. The world that seemed random and chaotic actually sent signals and warnings, and if interpreted correctly, it might be possible to prevent the disasters looming ahead. The end of this part leaves the reader with a question. Will the protagonists notice all the signs in time, and will they act quickly enough to influence the events already gaining momentum? Part 2. Signs and Warnings. The morning in New York began unexpectedly quiet. Usually, the streets buzzed with the sounds of cars, the hum of the subway, and the footsteps of pedestrians. But this time, the city seemed muted. Elizabeth felt a strange premonition, like a subtle tremor inside her chest. She couldn't explain why. It seemed as if the city itself had fallen silent to warn her of something. At her office on the 52nd floor, she reviewed financial flow statistics and sensed that the numbers were playing some hidden game. All the figures were correct, yet their arrangement and repeating patterns hinted at something more than routine analysis. Her subconscious screamed, "Pay attention to the details." Meanwhile, in London, Thomas observed similar strange coincidences. His journalistic intuition sensed that something serious was brewing. He noticed that the recent news, which at first seemed chaotic, followed a similar pattern. Transport accidents, brief power outages, unusual network delays, and sudden outbreaks of panic among people. The first unmistakable sign occurred in New York on the Brooklyn Bridge. Elizabeth was passing by and noticed something strange in the flow of movement. Cyclists suddenly stopped, cars began changing trajectories, and people seemed to move in sync with an invisible rhythm. She pulled out her phone and took a few photos, but most importantly, an image of an event that had not yet happened but was destined to, formed in her mind. In London, Thomas received another message from the same anonymous source. It contained a city map with markings at several intersections and a warning. Where the flows converge, the future is already beginning to change. Thomas realized that these strange coincidences were synchronous and could be deciphered if observed carefully. Elizabeth began documenting everything that happened. She noticed that even the smallest details, like a call at an unusual hour or a message from an unknown sender, repeated in a certain sequence. Each event was a signal, a tiny piece of a larger puzzle. She started keeping a journal, recording all coincidences and odd occurrences. Meanwhile, Thomas in London started building his own map of events. He tracked every incident, when and where a disruption occurred, which people were involved, and which details seemed non-random. He felt that these signals not only warned of the future, but could also be the key to changing it. Days passed, and the coincidences became increasingly noticeable. Minor crises appeared in both cities. Small accidents, chaotic events on the streets, unusual public transport disruptions. They were not deadly, but they hinted that something larger was looming. One morning, Elizabeth received a new message. "Watch the clock at the station. Time chooses its own." She did not understand what it meant, but a mental image of a potentially dangerous event formed in her mind. She began decoding the clues, searching for patterns in words and imagery. Meanwhile, Thomas attempted to contact official authorities to warn them about the strange coincidences and patterns. His warnings were met with irony. "Do you really think random events can be predicted?" asked a police representative. Thomas felt frustrated but could not give up. Something about this story told him that immediate action was necessary. In New York, Elizabeth discovered an old archived newspaper and noticed repeated events from the past that closely resembled current ones. She began constructing a chart, a chain of events indicating future coincidences. In her mind, the first map of the future took shape. At the same time, synchronous events between the cities became more apparent. An accident in New York coincided with a brief transport disruption in London. The events seemed causally unrelated, but mirrored each other like echoes. Elizabeth and Thomas did not yet know each other, but their actions were bringing them closer to the moment when their paths would cross. Their personal lives also began to align with this rhythm. Elizabeth felt alienated from friends and family. They did not notice the changes she perceived. Thomas noticed that his friends joked about his new investigations and did not take him seriously. Both felt pressure and loneliness, yet their intuition urged them forward. Continue, even if no one believes you. By the end of this part, the protagonists had begun piecing together the puzzle and noticing the signals, but they did not yet fully understand the scale of the events to come. They faced a choice: continue observing and attempt to predict the catastrophe, or step back and remain safe within the routine of everyday life. The reader is left with a sense of tension. The small signs can no longer be ignored, and they are gradually leading the protagonists toward the moment when their paths will intersect, a moment when their actions will become crucial to the events of the future. Part 3. Crossing Paths. Elizabeth sat at her desk in New York, examining the photos and notes she had accumulated over the past weeks. Every unsigned letter, every strange event on the city streets, every time signal on clocks and traffic lights formed an increasingly clear pattern. But the more data she gathered, the more she realized she couldn't decipher this puzzle alone. She ran through all the scenarios in her mind. Contacting the police or the media made no sense. Previous warnings had been met with ridicule. She needed someone who could view everything from another perspective. Someone with experience working with information, logic, and the ability to notice details others overlooked. Meanwhile, Thomas in London sat in a cafe, spreading out cards with all his notes and diagrams. He felt that several recent messages from the anonymous source were not random. It was clear someone or something was trying to draw his attention to a global pattern of events. His eyes rested on two key points, one in New York, the other in London. Suddenly, a thought struck him. What if these events are connected, even though thousands of kilometers separate the cities? That very day, their paths crossed for the first time, in the most unexpected way, through an online forum for investigators of unusual phenomena. Elizabeth created a thread under the pseudonym Observer, describing a series of strange synchronous events in New York. She attached photos, charts, and notes, hoping someone would notice a pattern. Thomas in London, browsing forums during this morning break, came across the Observer thread. He felt an instant connection. Many details matched his own observations. His heart raced as he posted a comment. "This looks like a global pattern. Can we exchange data?" The exchange of messages unfolded quickly. They began sharing records, charts, photos, coordinates, and descriptions of events. Each new detail confirmed that they were both seeing part of the larger picture. The thrilling realization struck them: something truly connected their cities, their lives, and a future that was trying to send signals. Their first joint conclusion was frightening. The small crises that seemed insignificant were actually preludes to a major catastrophe. If they didn't act now, events could spiral out of control. They decided to attempt warning authorities and the public, but bureaucracy and skepticism became the first obstacles. The New York police dismissed Elizabeth's tips as unreal, while in London, editorial colleagues laughed at Thomas. "You can't predict the future." This only heightened their sense of responsibility. They realized they had to act themselves before it was too late. One evening, during a video call, they decided to see the cities through each other's eyes. Thomas showed London from his office windows: fog over the Thames, crowded buses, random accidents at intersections. Elizabeth responded in kind: Manhattan at dusk, a traffic light that seemed out of rhythm with traffic flow, crowds moving in strangely synchronized patterns. This virtual exchange of reality became a turning point. They saw that the synchrony of events was not limited to their observations. It was real, measurable, and predictable. But the catastrophes were accelerating. On the Brooklyn Bridge, a minor collision involving several cars occurred. Almost simultaneously in London, a bus crashed into a barrier at a crowded intersection. Each event signaled that global instability was rising. Elizabeth and Thomas realized they could no longer just observe, they had to act. Alongside the external events, they faced internal conflicts. Elizabeth felt both fear and responsibility. What if her predictions were wrong? Thomas wrestled with doubts and loneliness. How could he explain to colleagues and family that events, seemingly chaotic, were actually governed by invisible laws? Under the pressure of these events, they devised their first joint plan of action, to create a map of predicted events, attempting to forecast the locations and times of the next crises to minimize their impact. This was their first step towards controlling the future, and they took it together, even across an ocean. By the end of this part, the reader senses that the protagonists are no longer just collecting signals and observing. They are active participants in the process. Their paths have crossed, and every step now matters, as their decisions will determine whether they can prevent the upcoming disasters. Tension rises, and the anticipation of the climax hangs palpably. Part 4. Fighting the Future. After Elizabeth and Thomas combined their efforts and created a map of predicted events, a new reality emerged. Knowing the future did not automatically make it controllable. They realized that even when you see what is about to happen, changing it is no simple task. Elizabeth began active operations in New York. She tried to warn local authorities about a series of transport accidents and potential catastrophic events in buildings. However, her warnings were dismissed as unfounded fears. "We cannot act on rumors," said an official, glancing at the charts Elizabeth had spent a week preparing. Thomas faced the same in London. His editorial team refused to publish material about the strange synchronous events. "This isn't news, it's fiction." The doubts and skepticism of those around them began to weigh heavily. Elizabeth felt her resources dwindling, while Thomas felt his reputation was at stake. But they did not stop. They began operating within their own means, organizing small groups of observers, gathering information, and tracking anomalies in the cities. Every small victory, preventing a minor accident, warning people about a transit disruption, gave them hope that their work had meaning. One evening, during a video call, they studied the event map and discovered a pattern too terrible to ignore. A major crisis was approaching, and its scale could be catastrophic. This time, it wasn't minor accidents. It involved something global: failures in energy grids, transport systems, and critical infrastructure all at once. Personal conflicts grew more intense. Elizabeth began to feel fatigue and fear. Her relationships with friends and family deteriorated as she was constantly immersed in observation and analysis. Thomas felt pressure from colleagues and editors and doubted his own ability to influence events. Yet they understood that retreat was no longer an option. They began developing a strategy to use knowledge of the future to guide people and organizations in the right direction. Every decision, every step on the map of potential events was critical. Elizabeth decided to act more radically. She accessed transport systems, using her analytical skills to anticipate chaotic movements and prevent accidents. Meanwhile, Thomas began creating a media platform to draw attention to the synchronous events, spreading information ignored by official institutions. At this time, the first serious casualties appeared. Small incidents escalated into chains of events that could no longer be controlled by observation alone. One of New York's bridges suffered partial damage due to a strange coincidence that Elizabeth had tried to prevent but failed to reach the appropriate authorities. Thomas in London saw his predictions confirmed. Brief power outages and transport accidents exceeded what he had forecasted. These events tested their faith in themselves. They realized that knowing the future was not enough. They had to have the courage to act, even when the system was against them, and even if every step risked personal safety and peace of mind. The internal conflicts of the protagonists reached their peak. Elizabeth faced a moral choice: risk her own life to warn the crowd, or step aside and save herself. Thomas struggled with fear of failure and guilt for those he couldn't warn in time. During this period, they began to notice the first signs of cooperation. Small groups of people started responding to their cues, changing behavior and minimizing harm. This gave hope that their efforts were not in vain. Elizabeth and Thomas realized that the future was not an absolute reality, but a field of possibilities, where every choice could change the outcome. By the end of this part, the reader sees the protagonists struggling not only with the chaos of events, but also with a system that refuses to believe and with their own fears and limitations. They have learned to value every signal, every small success, and not to give up, even when everything seems against them. The conclusion of this part leads the reader to the climax. A massive catastrophe is approaching, but the protagonists are armed with knowledge and determination. They are ready to act, to influence the course of events, and prove that even a future that seems inevitable can be changed.
Part 5. The sun was just beginning to break through the clouds over Manhattan when Elizabeth found herself once again on the Brooklyn Bridge. The city moved to its usual rhythm, but she knew today would be decisive. Her eyes carefully tracked every movement on the road, every traffic light signal, every sound that might forewarn another catastrophe. Meanwhile, Thomas in London watched the Thames from the roof of his office. The clouds and fog created an illusion of calm, but he knew chaos was building. His event map showed that the remaining hours were critical. Every decision they made now would be crucial to preventing a major disaster. Their work over the past weeks had borne fruit. Minor accidents that could have led to serious consequences were successfully prevented. But this was only preparation for the ultimate test. They had discovered a pattern connecting both cities and devised a plan of action. Coordination with local services, public warnings, traffic management, and critical infrastructure control. The first step was tracking anomalies in the transport systems. Elizabeth used her analytical skills to predict the next series of accidents on New York's bridges and intersections. She coordinated small groups of volunteers who helped warn drivers and pedestrians, guiding traffic along safe routes. Thomas did the same in London, using his media platform to alert the public. His messages included specific instructions: where to stop, where not to go, how to avoid dangerous areas. People began responding: bus delays, route changes, caution at intersections, all of which helped avert large-scale chaos. Yet the crisis itself allowed no margin for relaxation. Simultaneously, failures began in the power grids and communications networks. In New York, blackout zones created hazardous conditions for traffic, while in London, temporary network outages complicated coordination. The protagonists felt as if they were racing against time, trying to stay ahead of the inevitable. Personal trials reached their peak. Elizabeth barely found time to sleep or eat, monitoring every signal on screens and streets. Thomas battled his own fear of failure, with every call and message bringing new problems and stress. But their partnership via video calls helped them maintain focus. They felt each pulse of events in their cities together, as if the hearts of the two cities were beating in unison. The climax arrived when the small synchronous crises in New York and London began to merge into a chain reaction. On bridges, in subways, at intersections, the chaos grew. But thanks to their coordination, people were guided to safe locations, vehicles were used to manage flows, and unpredictable situations were handled swiftly. Elizabeth and Thomas watched their actions tangibly influence events. She saw cars navigating around blockages and people responding to signals and warnings. He saw Londoners following instructions and the temporarily disabled mobile networks coming back online thanks to local authorities' interventions. They realized that the future was not a fatal sequence of events, but a field of possibilities. Every action, every decision, every signal was a lever capable of changing the outcome. Together, they had influenced a major crisis, turning a potential catastrophe into controlled chaos where human lives were safe. The story's ending leaves the finale open. Elizabeth stood on the Brooklyn Bridge watching a city that breathed once again in its normal rhythm. Thomas sat on his office roof, observing the Thames and the city's hum. They knew this was only one possible version of the future. The signs and synchronicities had not vanished, they had simply become less threatening because the protagonists intervened. The reader is left with the understanding that the future is flexible. It responds to action, determination, attentiveness, and cooperation. Elizabeth and Thomas proved that even when everything seems chaotic and uncontrollable, humans can influence events if they notice the signals and act, rather than wait for the inevitable. And although the crisis had passed, new signals already flickered on the horizon. This hinted that the story was not over, that the future is always in motion, and that it requires attention and action from those who are able to see it.